into our second lesson on Native Americans. This lesson is called Changing Ways of Life. Last time we talked, we learned that the native people to North America came here from Asia, and they came here mostly by walking across a bridge of ice that historians call Beringia. They came here because they were following the animals that they hunted or their prey. Today we're going to learn about a major change in their way of life once they got here. But before we get started, let's look at some of the vocabulary words that you're going to see or hear in your lesson today. A generation is a noun, which means all of the people of about the same age within a society or a family. So a generation is a noun, and it refers to all of the people of about the same age within a society or a family. So all of the kids in our society are one generation. All of the parents are of another generation. It's the group of people in an age group in a society. All the grandparents are of another generation. So you're going to learn about different generations of Native Americans as we read today. The word lush is an adjective, and it's an adjective that means characterized by full and healthy growth, covered with a thick growth of healthy plants. So a lush land is going to have a lot of different kinds of plants on it. And we're going to see Native Americans found some lush regions or areas of North America, and when they found those areas, that changed their way of life. If you're taking notes today, go ahead and stop and write down your two vocabulary words, generation and lush. Write down their meaning and draw a picture to help you remember what they mean. Remember, you can do this on the note-taking page that we attached to our lesson today, or you can do it on any old piece of paper. After each slide today, you're going to go ahead and write down two things that you see in the illustration that connect to the text that you hear read aloud. So we're going to be looking at how each picture supports the text that you hear in the read aloud. And we'll stop and do some of them together along the way. All right, so let's get started with Lesson 2, Changing Ways of Life. As you learned in the previous read aloud, while they continued to hunt, fish, and gather, many native peoples also began to farm. This was a very important development that changed native people's way of life quite significantly or importantly. They began to plant and harvest crops such as squash, beans, and maize, which is corn. Farming added to the food supply and allowed some groups of people to have the choice to stay in one place instead of migrating to follow their prey. Native people's knowledge and understanding of nature, particularly of plants, was acquired over many years. Over time, they experimented with growing local grasses and gourds. Eventually, many of them developed the ability to grow a wider variety of plants. In addition to increasing their food supply by farming, native peoples also began to use plants to make things, such as clothing, medicine, homes, and household items. They began to raise animals as well, such as turkeys, while they also continued to hunt, gather, and fish. Now I want you to take a look at the picture and see if you can find anything that helps you to better understand the text. As I was reading, what picture did you see that made you think, oh yeah, that's what she's talking about? One thing I noticed in the text was these turkeys right here. I noticed that there were turkeys, and the text told me that they began to raise animals like turkeys. So one thing I learned from the illustration that was supported by the text was that the Native Americans started to raise turkeys. Another thing I noticed is that these friends over here look like they're harvesting crops. And the text told me that they used to grow local grasses and gourds. It tells me that they used to farm crops. So this illustration also helps me better understand that the native peoples learned how to grow crops. I also see these guys over here who look like they're about to go on a hunt. And so I also could say that this illustration helps me understand that the native people still had to hunt for their food. So the three things that I noticed were that they started to raise animals like turkeys. They started to farm and learn how to grow different kinds of plants, and that they still hunted as well. So those are the things that I would write down. Go ahead and pause the video and take your notes for this slide. You can just use bullet points if you're writing on a piece of paper. If you're writing on the worksheet that we made for you, go ahead and just fill in that box that says slide 1. And so, after a long period of time, many native peoples, having migrated across North America, came to live in groups that were called tribes. Each tribe had its own name, language, set of beliefs, and overall cultural identity. How each tribe lived, the clothes that the tribe members wore, the foods they ate, and the homes they lived in depended greatly upon the environment in which they lived. This is especially true of language. Different words were created that related specifically to regional beliefs and habitats. And so the languages of these native peoples became widely different from region to region and from tribe to tribe. Trade brought native peoples from different regions together, and a greater understanding of farming techniques spread. When tribes from different regions met to trade, they not only shared their ideas of farming techniques, they also traded crops and seeds. In this way, tribes began growing crops that were not native to the region in which they lived. With a more reliable food supply and the ability to store corn for 2 to 3 years to be used when there was not a good harvest, the population of Native Americans in North America began to increase, and large settlements began to develop in different regions. When I look at this picture, I notice that the headdresses that the different tribes wear are different. And so that helps support the idea that different tribes had different cultures or different customs. Another thing that I notice in the picture is that it looks like they're trading, and in the text it said that different tribes would trade with one another. Go ahead and jot those things down in your notes. Remember, you can pause the video anytime you want to, or if you miss something, you can always rewind it and go back. That is not to say that all tribes settled in one place, however. Some, such as the Shoshone, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot of the Central Plains, never really settled in the true sense of the word. They chose a nomadic existence. Remember, that means they kept on moving from place to place. They didn't stay settled in one home. They followed the enormous herds of buffalo that moved with the seasons. The buffalo provided them with everything they needed, including food, clothes, and the teepees that they lived in. It is believed that at one time there were more than 30 million buffalo across parts of North America. The culture of these Central Plains tribes grew out of their nomadic lifestyle. In your notes, jot down a few things that you learned from the illustration. Go ahead and pause the video. When you finish writing down your answers, unpause it. One thing that I noticed was that these people, this man, he looks like he's hunting something. And I know that these tribes used to hunt buffalo. So I would write down that some tribes used to hunt buffalo. I also noticed that this woman and child are carrying a lot of things, and these people look like they have everything they own with them on their horses. And I know that that's because they were nomadic. So I might write down that some tribes were still nomadic because they were hunting the buffalo. There were other groups of Native Americans, such as the southeastern Cherokee and the northeastern Iroquois, who moved from place to place in the wintertime. This is because the earth would not yield any food and hunting was their only way to survive. So they had settlements that they lived in the spring, but they left them in the winter to find better places to live and more food. Nevertheless, once large populations began to live in settlements, there came the need for new rules. These rules were designed to help a large number of people live together in one place, and so native tribes created their own unique governing systems. Generally, elected leaders or strong family groups were responsible for establishing tribal laws and making sure that they were obeyed. Spiritual leaders also guided their communities and participated in the decision-making process. Eventually, individual tribal laws, languages, clothing, customs, and religious beliefs began to set the tribes apart from each other. Go ahead and write down what you notice about the illustration that helps you remember the information in the read aloud. Then, when you're done writing, press play again. Did anybody notice that there are settlements here? I would write down that some tribes had settlements, but they left in the winter to go hunt. I also see this man here who looks like a leader, so I might say that tribes elected leaders and made rules so that they could all live together peacefully. Clothes were made from local resources too, and varied enormously from region to region. Furs and animal hides were worn in the colder regions and on the Great Plains. Cloth woven from plant fiber was common in warmer regions, and local plant dyes were used to embellish clothes and possessions. Many Native Americans also embellished their skin with markings, piercings, and tattoos. Go ahead and write down what you learned from the illustrations on this page. As the people of each tribe developed their own language, they told stories about their own history. They handed down their history from one generation to the next in that way. Did you hear a vocabulary word? Generation? This father shares the story with his son, passing it from one generation to another. They created their own unique fables and mythological tales to help explain the world in which they lived. They celebrated life, worshipped a variety of nature gods, and gave thanks for the resources planet Earth had provided them. This picture right here tells the story of a myth about how some Native American tribes believed that they got the sun. Go ahead and write down a couple things that you learned from this picture. One thing I might write down is how this part of the picture helps me understand the word generation. By the time Christopher Columbus and other Europeans arrived in North America thousands of years later, the journey that probably began with a nomadic people following herds of prehistoric mammals had brought about the creation of a very different world than that of the Europeans. It was a world that included many hundreds of unique native tribes, farming, trade, diverse or different cultures, and the building of immense ceremonial mounds. Native tribes were now dispersed or spread all across North America. Because Christopher Columbus thought that he had arrived in a part of Asia called the Indies, he called these native people Indians. However, they never called themselves Indians. Once the Europeans arrived in North America, the traditions of many of these native tribes were threatened and eventually destroyed. Armed confrontation, the introduction of new diseases, and cultural clashes meant that for many tribes, much of their traditional way of life was lost to them forever. What had taken thousands upon thousands of years to create was all but gone for many of the tribes. In the next part of this domain, you'll learn about some of the tribes who survived and still live in parts of North America. You'll discover what made them unique and knowledgeable and how they have helped and continue to help shape the history and culture of our country, the United States of America. Go ahead and write down some things that you've learned from this illustration. That's it for today, scholars. We'll see you tomorrow. Remember, you can submit your work by taking a picture of it and uploading it to your Google Classroom. You can have your mom or dad email it to us. You can complete the attached document on this assignment, or you can just do your work on a piece of paper at home and click Mark as Done, and we will know that you've completed this assignment. We hope you've enjoyed learning about Native Americans so far, and we're looking forward to learning more tomorrow.